Most people watching Eric Cartman just see a loud, bratty kid who says terrible things and eventually gets what's coming to him. A cartoon villain built for cheap laughs, nothing more. Comedy first, consequences later, reset by next week. However, mental health professionals who would have studied him seriously would not describe him that way. In this video, we break down the psychology of Eric Cartman, the Archie Bunker blueprint. Before Eric Cartman became the character most people associate with cold, calculated revenge, he was something much simpler. He was built as a joke about a certain kind of person that television had already spent decades laughing at. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the two men who created South Park, have said in plain terms that Cartman was meant to be a little version of Archie Bunker. Archie Bunker was the main character of a much older American show called All in the Family, which ran through the 1970s. Bunker was a loud, stubborn, working-class father who said whatever ignorant thing came into his head, usually about people from different backgrounds than his own, and the show around him was built so that audiences could laugh at how wrong he was while still finding him strangely likable. That is the exact shape Parker and Stone poured into a 10-year-old boy from a small mountain town in Colorado. South Park first aired on August 13th, 1997. The very first episode was called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, and even in that opening episode, before viewers knew anything else about this town or these kids, Cartman was already established as the one who pushes, mocks, and instigates. He was not introduced as a villain, he was introduced as comic relief, the fat kid with the big mouth who says the rude thing out loud that everyone else is too polite to say. That distinction matters a lot for understanding where his character started, because so much of what people now associate with Cartman, the manipulation, the disturbing revenge plots, the total lack of guilt, came later. In the beginning, he was mostly just loud. That very first episode is worth walking through briefly because it shows exactly how small the character's world still was before any of his later schemes existed. In the episode, Cartman wakes up believing something strange happened to him during the night. It turns out aliens visited him and performed a probe on him while he slept, and much of the episode follows Cartman trying to convince his friends and the adults around him that this actually happened, while nobody around him quite believes him. There is no elaborate scheme here, no multi-step plan, no prediction of how anyone else will behave. Cartman spends the entire episode simply reacting, confused and a little scared, to something that happened to him rather than something he engineered himself. This matters because it shows a character still finding his footing, still closer to a frightened, attention-seeking kid than the patient operator he eventually becomes. The character did not actually begin his life inside South Park at all. Years before the show existed, Trey Parker and Matt Stone made a short film in 1992 while they were both students at the University of Colorado called The Spirit of Christmas. The film was made using nothing more than construction paper cutouts filmed frame by frame with an old camera, and it featured 4 young boys who closely resembled the eventual main cast of South Park, living in a snowy mountain town very similar to the one the show would later be set in. What makes this short film especially worth knowing about is a small, strange detail buried inside it. The character who looked almost exactly like Cartman, wearing the same kind of winter coat and cap that would later define his look on the show, was not actually named Cartman at all in this earliest version. He was named Kenny. Meanwhile, the hooded character, who would go on to become the actual Kenny McCormick, appeared in this same short without any name given to him at all. 3 years later, in 1995, a Fox television executive named Brian Graydon, who had seen the original student film and enjoyed it, paid Parker and Stone a small sum of money to make a second short film as a Christmas video card he could send to friends. This second short, again called The Spirit of Christmas, developed the characters much further, giving them designs and voices far closer to what audiences would eventually see on television. By this point, the names had been sorted out into the ones the show would keep permanently, with the character resembling Cartman finally being called Cartman, and the hooded character taking on the name Kenny for good. Nobody involved in making either of these short films has ever fully explained why the names were originally assigned the way they were in that first version, or why they were swapped by the time the second one was made. What is known for certain is that the physical character audiences now recognize as Cartman, the heavyset boy in the red jacket, existed as a visual design a full 5 years before South Park ever aired as a television series, and briefly carried a completely different name while doing so. This second short film became genuinely popular once Graydon began distributing it, first among a small group of around 80 friends, and then much further as copies were passed along and eventually shared more widely. Its popularity is part of what led directly to Comedy Central deciding to develop these characters into a full series, one that would premiere in 1997 as South Park. Fox itself, the network that had originally commissioned the short as a private Christmas card, had actually been offered the chance to turn it into a series first and turn the idea down, reportedly due to discomfort with one of the show's other characters being built around a sentient piece of feces. That character would later become a recurring holiday figure, but the point remains that South Park, and Cartman specifically, existed for years in a much smaller, stranger form before ever reaching the screen as the show people know today. Trey Parker himself provides the voice for Cartman, and has done so for the entire run of the show, which by now spans well over 2 decades. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the man who created the character is also the man who has to physically perform his cruelty, his whining, his rage, and eventually his most disturbing moments, episode after episode, for almost 30 years. Parker also voices other characters on the show, including Stan Marsh, one of the more grounded and reasonable kids in the group. So the same voice that gives life to South Park's moral center also gives life to its most self-serving, bigoted resident. That is not a detail that changes how the character works on screen, but it says something about how deeply Parker and Stone were willing to commit to making Cartman feel real rather than cartoonish, even from the start. Cartman lives with his mother, Leanne Cartman, in the town of South Park. He does not have a father in his life growing up, and this absence becomes a recurring subject across many early seasons, treated as a running joke rather than a serious emotional wound, at least at first. He attends South Park Elementary, and for the first several seasons of the show, he and his friends are shown in the 3rd grade, before the show eventually moved them up to the 4th grade starting in its 4th season. His teacher for most of this time is Mr. Garrison, a man who is himself unstable and inappropriate in ways that make the classroom feel less like a place of order and more like an extension of the chaos surrounding these kids everywhere else in town. Cartman's defining physical trait, at least in these early years, is his weight. He is teased constantly for being overweight, and this becomes one of the most consistent sources of conflict in his life, something other kids use against him and something he is deeply sensitive about despite pretending not to care. His defining personality trait, though, is his mouth. He says racist things, sexist things, and specifically anti-Semitic things, often aimed at his friend Kyle, who is Jewish. This is not incidental to the character. It is central to what Parker and Stone were building when they compared him to Archie Bunker. Bunker's prejudice was the entire engine of his comedy. The joke was never that audiences were supposed to agree with him. The joke was that a person could hold views that ignorant and still walk through the world acting like he was the reasonable one in the room. Cartman works the same way, except he is 10 years old, which makes the same prejudice land very differently. An adult saying something ignorant can be written off as a product of an older generation. A child saying it suggests something is being absorbed, or something is simply present in him without any clear source at all. Part of how this prejudice gets expressed on screen from very early on is through the way Cartman refers to Kyle by name. Rather than pronouncing it normally, Cartman consistently mispronounces it in a flat, nasal, mocking way, turning Kyle into something closer to call, a small vocal habit that becomes one of the character's most recognized verbal tics over the years. It is a tiny detail, but it shows how thoroughly this prejudice was woven into the character from the ground up, present even in something as small as how he says his friend's name out loud, rather than only appearing during bigger, more dramatic moments of conflict. It would be easy to assume a character built this way exists purely to be hated. That is not what happened. Cartman quickly became one of the most popular characters on the show, and eventually one of the most recognized characters in American animation. He has been ranked on multiple television lists over the years as one of the greatest cartoon characters ever created, and one list from a major entertainment magazine placed him in the top 10 cartoon characters of all time. A separate ranking of television's greatest villains placed him 24th on its list, while another list built around pop culture icons more broadly, spanning film, television, and music together, placed him near the 200th position out of a very long list of names. A television special built around ranking the greatest characters in the medium's history placed him 19th overall. Years later, in 2014, a major entertainment website ranked him first place on a list built specifically around the characters of South Park itself, ahead of every other person in the entire town, describing the choice as an obvious one rather than a difficult decision. Another ranking, put together for television audiences, placed him just behind a much older cartoon villain as one of the scariest characters on television, describing him as a mix of pure evil wrapped up in the body of a cartoon child, someone who takes real, visible delight in the harm he causes. That contrast, being ranked both as a beloved character and as something close to frightening, tells you almost everything about how carefully this character was constructed. He is not written to be simply hated or simply loved. He is written so that both both reactions can exist in the same person watching him at the same time. Part of why this works goes back to the Archie Bunker comparison. Bunker was never meant to be purely evil either. He was meant to be familiar. Audiences watching All in the Family in the 1970s likely knew someone like him, an older relative, a neighbor, someone from an earlier generation whose views were shaped by a world that no longer existed the same way. Watching him is uncomfortable, but it is also recognizable, and that recognition is what makes satire work instead of simply becoming an attack. Cartman borrows that same structure but removes the excuse of age. He cannot be written off as a product of a different era because he is a child in the present day, surrounded by other children his own age who do not share his views. His friends Stan, Kyle, and Kinney consistently push back against him, argue with him, and call out his behavior, which means the show is never asking the audience to agree with Cartman. It is asking the audience to notice that a person this young can already be this certain of ideas this wrong, and to sit with why that might be. This is also where the show's use of comedy becomes important to understand, because it changes how seriously anything Cartman says gets treated by the people around him. In the early seasons, his prejudice functions mostly as a punchline. He says something offensive, another character reacts with shock or annoyance, and the moment passes, often followed by something absurd happening to Cartman himself as a kind of correction, a pie-in-the-face version of consequence. This rhythm, offense followed by mild punishment, is common in a lot of early sitcom writing, and it kept Cartman feeling less like a threat and more like an annoying kid who says dumb things and then gets what is coming to him. For a long stretch of the show's run, that rhythm was basically the whole story. He would scheme, the scheme would usually fail, and he would end up humiliated in some way that restored a kind of balance by the end of the episode. Part of what made this rhythm land so consistently, even in these earliest episodes, is the specific language Cartman was given to work with. He was quickly given a set of catchphrases that became instantly recognizable, including a demanding, drawn-out complaint aimed at whoever happened to be denying him something he wanted, and a flat, blunt line he would deliver whenever a plan of his fell apart and he decided to simply walk away from the situation entirely rather than face the consequences of it directly. These lines were repeated often enough across enough different episodes that they became shorthand for the character himself, something audiences could recognize and anticipate before Cartman even finished speaking. This kind of repetition is common in sitcom writing generally, but it mattered specifically for Cartman because it gave his early, simpler brand of selfishness a rhythm and a voice distinct from every other character in the town, long before his behavior escalated into anything more calculated. What makes this early version of Cartman worth studying carefully is that almost none of his behavior in this period could be called calculated in any serious sense. His plans are usually simple and often driven by something small, like wanting attention, wanting money, or wanting to avoid being embarrassed. He lies easily and without guilt, which even early on separates him from his friends, who at least occasionally feel bad about deceiving people. Cartman rarely does, but the lies themselves tend to be short-term and reactive rather than long-term and engineered. He wants something right now. He says whatever gets him closer to having it, and the show usually resolves the episode before those lies can build into anything larger. This matters because it draws a clear line between who Cartman is at the start of the series and who he becomes later. The foundation is already visible, the willingness to lie without discomfort, the total lack of concern for how his words affect other people, the prejudice that seems to exist in him without explanation. But the scale of what he is willing to do with those traits has not yet grown into anything close to what later seasons would eventually show. His mother, Leanne, is part of this early picture too, though her role becomes more important later on. In these years, she is mostly shown as permissive and somewhat clueless, unable or unwilling to correct her son's behavior in any meaningful way. The show describes her, through dialogue from other characters, in unflattering terms related to her personal life, and this becomes a running joke of its own for a long stretch of episodes, particularly around the mystery of who Cartman's father actually is. That mystery sits unresolved for years, treated mostly as material for jokes rather than as something the show seems interested in answering seriously, at least not yet. What all of this adds up to, in this earliest version of the character, is something closer to a comedic device than a fully formed personality. He is loud, he is prejudiced in ways that feel copied from an older generation rather than built from any lived experience of his own. He lies without a second thought, he schemes for small, selfish reasons and usually loses. He is teased for his weight and hides how much that bothers him behind aggression toward everyone around him. None of this, on its own, would have suggested to anyone watching those early episodes that this character would eventually become one of the most most disturbing figures in the history of American television comedy. The blueprint was simple. A child version of a bigoted television dad dropped into a small mountain town surrounded by kids who mostly know better than to believe anything he says. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one episode years later that the creators themselves point to as the moment this changed for good. It involves a boy named Scott Tenorman, $16, and a plan too patient to belong to a spoiled child. Section 2. The Turn. Scott Tenorman must die. There is a specific episode that both critics and the people who made the show point to as the moment Eric Cartman stopped being a bratty kid who occasionally does something mean and became something else entirely. That episode is called Scott Tenorman Must Die. It aired on July 11th, 2001 as the 4th episode of the show's 5th season, and it was the 69th episode of the series overall. It was written entirely by Trey Parker and directed by the show's longtime animation director Eric Stowe. To understand why this one episode carries so much weight in any serious study of Cartman's character, it helps to walk through exactly what happens in it step by step, because the plot itself is the argument. Nothing about this episode needs exaggeration. The events, laid out plainly, already say everything. The story begins small. A 9th grader named Scott Tenorman convinces Cartman to buy a small bag of pubic hair from him for $16.12. Scott tells Cartman that eating pubic hair, or in some tellings simply owning it, is a step toward reaching puberty faster, and Cartman, desperate to grow up and stop being treated like a little kid, believes him. When Cartman later tells his friends Stan and Kyle about his purchase, they immediately explain to him that pubic hair grows naturally on a person's body as they age, and that there is no way to buy your way into puberty. Cartman realizes he has been tricked out of his money by an older kid, and from that moment on, the episode becomes about nothing except Cartman trying to get that $16.12 back. Before the episode reaches the point most people remember it for, it spends real time showing exactly how many ordinary, low-stakes attempts Cartman makes to simply get his money back through normal means. He goes to Scott's house directly and asks for a refund, only to be turned away and threatened. He then tries returning in disguise, pretending to be an entirely different person, specifically dressing up as a tax collector in an attempt to trick Scott into handing money back through some official-sounding excuse. Scott sees through this immediately, and instead uses the moment to trick Cartman even further, convincing him to spend even more money chasing pubic hair that does not exist. At one point, Scott lures Cartman all the way to a nearby town called Fort Collins, with the promise of more hair waiting for him there, leaving Cartman stranded without any way to get home once he realizes there was never anything waiting for him at all. He ends up having to sneak into the back of a stranger's truck just to make it back to South Park, arriving home broke and soaked from the rain. Even after all of this, Scott is not finished humiliating him. In one of the more publicly embarrassing moments of the episode, Scott forces Cartman into a small, degrading performance in exchange for a tiny amount of money back, making him dance around like a pig in front of him before revealing that the amount being returned is far smaller than what Cartman originally lost. Once Cartman finishes this humiliating routine, Scott mocks him further by taking the small amount of money Cartman had left and burning it directly in front of him, making clear that the money itself was never really the point for Scott. The point was watching Cartman degrade himself for something worthless. This moment is the one that finally pushes Cartman from simply wanting his money back into wanting real revenge. And it is worth noting how ordinary and human this specific trigger is. Cartman is not reacting to some grand betrayal. He is reacting to public embarrassment over a small amount of money, the exact same kind of small, personal grievance that fuels most of his other schemes across the show. What follows this point is where Cartman's plans begin escalating in ways that go beyond simple revenge and start involving other people entirely. His first serious attempt involves a pony belonging to a local farmer named Denkins. Cartman spends time trying to train this pony to attack Scott physically, using a decoy dressed to resemble him as practice. This attempt fails in an almost comically weak way, with the pony behaving nothing like Cartman intended. Frustrated that this approach is not working, Cartman shifts to a completely different plan built around something he discovers by watching Scott's house at night, that Scott is a devoted fan of the English rock band Radiohead. Once Cartman learns this, an entirely new scheme takes shape in his mind, one built around using Scott's own admiration for this band against him. Cartman's plan here is intricate enough to be worth describing directly. He arranges to have Radiohead invited to South Park, under the pretense that Scott is a dying fan hoping to meet them before passing away. Separately, he prepares a recorded interview segment, planning to dub his own voice over real footage of the band being interviewed by a television host, making it sound as though the band members themselves despise Scott personally and refuse to ever tour again specifically because of their disgust for him. This plan, elaborate as it is, ultimately falls apart. Scott manages to obtain and broadcast an unaltered version of the real interview, publicly proving that Cartman had faked the entire thing, and pairs this reveal with a separate, deeply embarrassing video showing Cartman pretending to be a pig from an earlier, failed part of his revenge attempts. This double humiliation, aired in front of the entire town, becomes so devastating for Cartman that his own friend Kenny, watching the video, laughs himself into an early death, one of many such deaths the show gave this specific character across its early seasons. It is at this exact point, after every direct, straightforward attempt at revenge has failed and left Cartman more humiliated than before, that the show reveals its real plan had already been in motion for some time. Rather than being crushed by this final public failure, Cartman is shown retreating to his room and beginning to laugh, not from despair, but from what the episode frames as genuine building excitement. What follows is presented to the audience as a spontaneous new idea, when in reality, as the ending will reveal, everything from this point forward had already been carefully set in motion long before this humiliating video ever aired. Then the conflict escalates in a way that starts to feel different. Scott decides he is not finished. He gathers pubic hairs from the other kids in town and mixes them into a bowl of chili, planning to feed it to Cartman in front of the entire town at a chili cooking contest, as one final public humiliation. When Stan and Kyle hear about this plan, they tell Cartman it is the most ridiculous thing they have ever seen him get involved in, but Cartman insists it will all make sense once Scott arrives. On the day of the contest, something unexpected happens. Scott, wanting to make sure his trick works exactly as planned, asks Cartman to be the one to taste his chili first, since he claims it will help him win the contest. Cartman agrees. What the audience does not know yet, and what Scott does not know either, is that Cartman has already secretly switched Scott's chili with a completely different bowl, one prepared by the town's cook, Chef. The chili Scott intended to use against Cartman never even reaches him. At this point, the episode reveals that everything happening on screen up to now was not really the plot at all. Cartman calmly tells Scott that he already knew about the pubic hair chili days in advance. He explains that he knew Stan and Kyle would tell Scott about it because he had made sure they would find out, using them as unwitting messengers. He also reveals that he had spread a different, false story to Scott earlier, telling him that Cartman had trained a nearby farmer's pony to bite off Scott's genitals. Scott, believing this and wanting to prevent it, warned his own parents that an abandoned pony on Farmer Denkin's land needed to be rescued, not realizing this was information Cartman had planted specifically so Scott's parents would go looking for it. Cartman had also separately gone to Farmer Denkin's ahead of time and warned him that dangerous pony killers were roaming the area near his property, and that he should protect himself from trespassers by any means necessary. When Scott's parents went out to the ranch that night to save the pony they believed was in danger, Farmer Denkins, believing them to be the very trespassers he had been warned about, shot and killed them both. He later explained to the police that he believed he was defending his property from people who meant to harm him. While Denkins was busy giving his account of what happened to the town's police officer, Cartman went to the scene, took the bodies of Scott's parents, and spent the entire night cutting them into pieces so he could cook them into a pot of chili. That chili is the bowl Cartman handed to Scott at the contest, calling it by a specific name that made clear exactly what was inside it. Scott, confused at first, reached into the bowl and pulled out his mother's wedding ring, still on what remained of her finger, and understood everything at once. What happens immediately after this reveal is, in some ways, just as important as the reveal itself. The English band Radiohead, who appear in this episode as themselves, having been invited to South Park earlier in Cartman's plan, under the belief that Scott is a fan of theirs and dying of an illness, arrive at the contest just as Scott is breaking down over what he has just learned. Not knowing anything about what has actually happened, the band members see a crying boy in front of them and, in their own voices, mock him for being a crybaby, telling him that everyone has problems and he does not need to make such a scene about it. Scott is left sobbing in front of the entire town, having just unknowingly eaten his own parents, while a band he admires openly ridicules him for crying. Cartman, rather than showing any hesitation at this point, walks over, leans towards Scott's face, and licks his tears away, calling them delicious. He then turns to the crowd and sings a taunting little rhyme, making sure everyone present understands exactly what he has done and that he considers it a win. The episode ends there with Stan and Kyle, who had been on Scott's side for most of the episode and had even helped warn him about the pony, staring at Cartman in complete shock. Neither of them says anything is funny about about what just occurred. Instead, the episode's final note is one of quiet, genuine horror. Kyle tells Stan that it might be best for the two of them to never make Cartman angry again, and the line lands as sincere advice rather than a joke, which is unusual for a show that almost always closes an episode with some kind of punchline or reset. It is worth being precise about why this particular sequence of events matters so much more than any of Cartman's earlier schemes on the show. In almost every previous episode involving Cartman getting revenge on someone, his plans were reactive, simple, and usually built around some immediate emotional need, like wanting attention or wanting to avoid embarrassment. This time, the plan required Cartman to predict, days or even weeks in advance, exactly how several different people would behave. He had to correctly guess that his two best friends would side with Scott and warn him about a threat Cartman had invented specifically so it would be passed along. He had to correctly guess that Scott would react to that warning by telling his own parents, rather than simply avoiding the pony himself. He had to correctly guess that Scott's parents would go out to the ranch at night to rescue an animal they believed was in danger. And he had to correctly guess that a farmer he had previously warned about violent trespassers would respond to two people showing up on his property in the dark by shooting them without asking questions first. Every one of these predictions had to land correctly in the right order for the plan to work at all. If even one person had behaved differently, none of it comes together, and Scott never eats his parents in a bowl of chili at a contest that Cartman himself set the terms for. That level of patience and planning, built entirely around understanding how other people think and act under pressure, is simply not present anywhere else in the character up to this point in the show. The way this episode came together behind the scenes tells its own story about how differently it was treated compared to most other episodes of South Park. The show is generally known for being written, animated, and finished within roughly 1 week of its broadcast date. This episode broke that pattern entirely. Writing on it reportedly began in the middle of May of 2001, more than a full month before that season had even started airing, which for a show built around fast turnaround and current events was highly unusual. The episode also did not originally carry the title audiences know it by today. In its earliest drafts, the boy at the center of the story was given a slightly different last name, and the episode itself carried a slightly different title to match. Before Parker decided, the name eventually used sounded funnier and made the change. Despite being written well ahead of the season, the episode was not used as the season's premiere. It was deliberately placed later as the 4th episode, airing after 3 other stories had already introduced that season to audiences. Small details in the animation itself point to how much care went into making this episode feel grounded despite its outrageous subject matter. The pubic hairs shown throughout the episode, used in the pubic hair trade at the center of the plot, were not simply drawn from imagination. They were created using digitally scanned images of real hair taken from the back of the neck of one of the show's own lead storyboard artists. A small, strange piece of production trivia that shows how far the animation team was willing to go even for a joke most viewers would never think twice about. On the voice side, the episode relied on the show's typical small core cast, with Trey Parker and Matt Stone providing most of the male voices as usual, while 2 other performers handled additional female roles needed throughout the story. Scott Tenorman himself was voiced by a separate performer brought in specifically for this recurring role. Even a small continuity detail from the episode is worth mentioning, since it shows how quickly these episodes were sometimes finished, despite the extra time given to this particular one. Early in the episode, Kyle refers to Scott as a 9th grader, but later in the same episode during a different scene, Scott is instead referred to as an 8th grader. This kind of small inconsistency is common across the show's history, given how quickly most episodes are produced, and this episode was no exception despite receiving more advanced planning than most. The episode's reputation only grew stronger in the years following its original broadcast. A major entertainment website gave the episode a score of 9.5 out of 10 shortly after release, and it has continued to perform extremely well in fan voting long after that initial praise. When a major digital media store ran a public poll in 2011 asking fans to help select the 10 most popular episodes in the show's history, this episode placed 2nd overall. A decade later, in a separate tournament-style poll run in 2021 specifically ranking every South Park episode against each other, it again finished in 2nd place, losing only to a separate fan-favorite episode centered on an entirely different storyline. Parker and Stone themselves have described the back-and-forth dynamic between Cartman and Scott across the episode, the escalating pranks and reprisals building towards something much larger, as reminding them of the kind of classic cartoon rivalry seen in shows built around one character endlessly scheming against another, the kind of dynamic long familiar to anyone who grew up watching older animated cartoons built around exactly that structure. The episode's impact did not stay contained to itself either. In several other episodes airing later that same season, Cartman is shown using a specific threatening phrase directed at people who anger him, telling them that he will make them eat their own parents. A direct and chilling callback to what actually happened here, repeated often enough afterward that it became one of the character's more disturbing recurring lines for a period of time. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spoken about this episode many times since it first aired, and their own comments make clear that they saw it as a turning point, not just for Cartman as a character, but for how they approached writing the show going forward. Parker has explained in interviews that this was the first time they realized they might have been trying to pack too much into each episode. Earlier seasons of the show often ran 2 or 3 loosely connected storylines at once, cutting back and forth between them until they came together by the end. When they sat down to write this episode, they found they could only come up with one storyline strong enough to fill the runtime: the back and forth battle between Cartman and Scott. They have said they worried at first that having only a single plot with no smaller side story running alongside it would make the episode feel thin or boring. Once the episode was finished, they realized the opposite was true. A single, tightly built story with nothing pulling attention away from it worked better than anything with multiple plots running at once. From that point forward, many episodes of South Park followed this same one-story approach, and Parker and Stone have both credited this episode specifically with teaching them that lesson. They have also talked about the writing decision at the center of the episode itself, meaning the choice to have Cartman go this far. Parker has said that the writers debated whether feeding a child his own dead parents was something even Cartman, a character already established as cruel and selfish, would actually do. Ultimately, they decided that this act, terrible as it was, still fell just short of Cartman committing murder with his own hands. He did not pull the trigger. He engineered a situation where someone else did, using other people's choices and predictable behavior as the actual weapon. This distinction mattered enough to the writers that Parker has described it as a way of setting a new limit for what Cartman was capable of without crossing into being a character who kills people directly himself. It is a small distinction on paper, but it says something meaningful about how carefully this moment was constructed. Cartman never touches a weapon in this episode. Every terrible thing that happens is the result of him understanding, correctly, how other people would react to information he chose to give them. The reaction to this episode, both from fans and from critics, has remained remarkably consistent in the years since it aired. In a poll conducted by Comedy Central not long after the episode's release, fans voted the ending of this episode as Cartman's greatest moment in the entire show, a description that captures exactly how strangely this episode gets remembered. It is not simply seen as his cruelest moment or his most disturbing moment, though it is certainly both of those things. It is remembered by many fans as his best moment, the one that most fully shows what the character is capable of when every part of his personality, patience, cruelty, intelligence, and total lack of guilt is working together at once. The episode has continued to be ranked extremely highly by critics and by fan surveys over the years since, frequently appearing at or near the top of lists ranking the greatest episodes in the show's entire history, which by now spans well over 300 episodes across more than 2 decades. There is also a smaller, more technical piece of history behind this episode that is worth mentioning, because it shows how much care went into even the smallest details. The rock band Radiohead, who appear as themselves near the end of the episode, were on tour in the United States around the time the episode was being made. Rather than simply writing lines for cartoon versions of the band and hoping it would work, Matt Stone drove from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara, where the band was performing, in order to record their actual voices for the episode in person. Stone has talked about directing the band's lead singer during that session, telling him to put more emotion into his lines, since normal speaking voices tend to sound flat when they are placed into animation without some exaggeration. Stone has noted the strange irony of having to coach a singer known for his ability to convey deep emotion through music into performing simple, mocking dialogue with enough energy to land as a joke. This level of effort, driving out of town personally to record a band's real voices rather than using impersonations, reflects how seriously the show's creators treated even a single scene that most viewers would only remember as a brief, mocking cameo. The animation itself had also reached a new level of quality by this point in the show's run. Earlier seasons of South Park used simpler, more limited character movement, largely because of the technology available at the time. By the 5th season, the show had shifted to newer software that allowed for far more detailed facial expressions, which becomes especially important in the final minutes of this episode. Scott's face, as he slowly realizes what he has eaten, is animated with much more range than the show's earlier character work would have allowed. And that added detail is part of why the moment lands as genuinely upsetting rather than simply another cartoon gag. A show built around crude, simple drawings found a way, through small technical improvements, to make a child's face convey real horror. The episode has also had a long life on home video and streaming, released across multiple formats over the years. From an early VHS collection put together not long after it aired, to a full season DVD box set a few years later, to a special fan favorite compilation the creators themselves helped select episodes for, all the way through later box sets and a high definition release put out well over a decade after the episode first appeared on television. This kind of repeated repackaging across format after format over more than 20 years says something about how the episode has never really faded from the show's ongoing identity, staying available and relevant to new audiences long after it originally aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this would matter nearly as much if the episode had been treated as a one-time event, a shocking outlier the show never referenced again. It was not treated that way. Nearly a decade later, the show returned to this exact storyline and built an entire pair of episodes around a single piece of information buried inside it, something that had been sitting there the whole time without either the characters or most viewers realizing its full weight. The question at the center of those later episodes was simple on its surface. Who is Eric Cartman's father? The answer, when it finally arrived, connected directly back to the two people Cartman had already killed and fed to Scott Tinnerman years earlier, and it turned an already disturbing episode into something even stranger and more personal than anyone watching it in 2001 could have known. Section 3. Premeditation as a character trait. There is a specific quality in Cartman that separates him from almost every other cartoon character built for comedy, and it becomes visible once you start comparing episodes side by side instead of watching them one at a time, months or years apart. That quality is planning. Not the kind of planning where a character comes up with a rough idea and hopes it works out. The kind of planning where a character thinks several steps ahead, predicts exactly how other people will react to something, and builds an entire chain of events around those predictions before doing anything at all. Once this pattern becomes visible, it shows up again and again across the show's history, in episodes that have nothing to do with each other on the surface, years apart, involving completely different people and completely different stakes. One of the clearest early examples happens in an episode called Cherokee Hair Tampons, which aired on June 28, 2000, more than a year before Scott Tinnerman must die. In this episode, Cartman's friend Kyle becomes seriously ill with kidney failure caused by his diabetes, and doctors determine that Cartman is the only person in town with a matching blood type who could donate a kidney and save Kyle's life. Cartman's response to this information is immediate and completely without hesitation. He does not need time to think it over. He tells Stan, who comes to ask for his help, that he will gladly donate the kidney, but only in exchange for $10 million. When Stan points out that Kyle will die without the surgery, Cartman does not soften his position even slightly. He simply repeats that he needs the money first. What makes this moment worth pairing with Cartman's more elaborate schemes is not the demand itself, which is fairly simple and reactive, but what happens next. Once Stan and a small group of other kids decide to try to take the kidney by force while Cartman sleeps, Cartman is shown to already be prepared for exactly this possibility. He is wearing a device his mother purchased for him called a Kidney Blocker 2000, specifically because he anticipated that someone might try to take the organ from him without his permission. This detail is small, almost a throwaway joke in the episode itself, but it reveals something important about how Cartman's mind works even in a story that is mostly about greed rather than long-term strategy. He does not simply react to threats as they happen. He builds in protection against threats he expects might come later, before anyone has actually tried anything. Cartman is eventually tricked anyway when his mother secretly removes the device while he sleeps and stages the scene to look like the kidney has already been taken. When Cartman wakes up and realizes what appears to have happened, he marches immediately to get the kidney back, still refusing to help his sick friend even under the belief that the organ removal already occurred. It is only through deception on the part of the adults around him that Kyle ends up receiving the transplant he needs. Cartman never chooses to help. He is manipulated into helping without his knowledge or consent. This distinction matters because it shows a version of Cartman whose planning exists purely to protect his own interests and refuses to bend even when a friend's life is on the line. There is no guilt shown anywhere in this episode. There is no moment where Cartman wavers. His plan is simple, but it is still a plan, built in advance based on correctly guessing that people close to him might try to take from him what he refuses to give freely. A more developed example of this same trait appears 3 years later in an episode called Casa Bonita, which aired on November 12, 2003. In this episode, Kyle's mother allows him to invite 3 friends to celebrate his birthday at Casa Bonita, a large, elaborate restaurant that Cartman has openly admitted is his favorite place in the entire world. Kyle chooses Stan, Kenny, and a boy named Butters, deliberately leaving Cartman out because of his constant anti-Semitic remarks toward Kyle. Cartman's reaction to being excluded moves through several stages, and each stage is worth walking through carefully, because the episode is essentially a small case study in how Cartman solves a problem when something he desperately wants is taken away from him. His first instinct is anger. He lashes out at Kyle directly, telling him he does not even want to go to his birthday party anyway, and saying he hopes Kyle dies. This is the version of Cartman most viewers already know well by this point in the show. Loud, insulting, and reactive. But this anger does not get him what he wants, and Cartman appears to understand this almost immediately. Rather than continuing to demand an invitation through insults, he shifts strategy entirely. He decides to try being kind to Kyle, something the episode makes clear does not come naturally to him at all. His early attempts at kindness fail badly, including a moment where he beats up a boy with a physical disability while insisting this counts as defending Kyle's mother's honor, completely missing the point of what kindness actually looks like. Eventually, though, he manages something that reads as a genuine apology, telling Kyle he is sorry for the years of abuse he has directed at him because of his religion, and saying he hopes they can still be friends. Kyle, visibly moved by what seems like real change, tells Cartman that if Butters is ever unable to attend for some reason, Cartman can take his place. This is the exact opening Cartman was working toward the entire time. As soon as Kyle says this, Cartman immediately shifts into planning mode. He tells Butters, one of the more trusting and easily convinced kids in town, that a meteor roughly the size of a small state is about to strike Earth, and that Butters needs to hide immediately in an old bomb shelter for his own safety. Butters, believing him completely, does exactly this. With Butters out of the picture, Cartman positions himself to take his place on the trip to Casa Bonita. What follows is not a single lie that resolves quickly. It becomes a sustained, multi-day operation. When the town realizes Butters is missing and begins searching everywhere, including places like bomb shelters, Cartman has to move Butters again to keep him hidden, eventually locking him inside an old refrigerator at an abandoned gas station for what he claims is Butters' own protection from a fictional radioactive threat. Butters ends up being accidentally hauled away inside that refrigerator by a garbage truck and dumped at the town landfill, where he spends days believing he is living through the end of the world, building a tiny fake society out of trash with a stray dog he finds there, completely unaware that nothing outside his own imagination has actually happened. This entire chain of events, the apology, the fake meteor, the repeated relocation of Butters, the elaborate cover story sustained over the better part of a week, was not something Cartman stumbled into by accident. It required him to correctly predict that acting kind, even briefly and insincerely, would soften Kyle's position. It required him to correctly predict that Butters, given a frightening enough story, would hide without asking too many questions. It required ongoing adjustments as circumstances changed, moving Butters from one location to another as the search for him expanded. None of this looks like a child simply losing his temper and lashing out. It looks like a person solving a problem the way an adult negotiating something difficult might, identifying the obstacle, working out what needs to happen to remove it, and adjusting the plan as new information comes in. The ending of the episode is worth sitting with as well, because it shows exactly how little any of this troubles Cartman once the truth comes out. Butters is eventually found and tells the police everything that happened to him. Just as Cartman finally arrives at Casa Bonita with Kyle, Stan, and Kenny, having gotten exactly what he wanted, Kyle's mother receives a phone call revealing Cartman's involvement in the entire ordeal. Rather than panicking or trying to talk his way out of it, Cartman spends his last few minutes of freedom sprinting through the restaurant, trying to experience every attraction and eat as much food as he possibly can before police officers finally catch and arrest him. When an officer asks him directly whether everything he did, terrifying a young boy for days, causing a town-wide search, losing all of his friends in the process, and earning himself a week in juvenile detention was actually worth it, Cartman answers without any hesitation at all. He says it was totally worth it. That single word, totally, said with complete sincerity rather than sarcasm, tells you something important about how Cartman evaluates his own actions. He is not shown feeling regret. He is not shown weighing the cost of what he did against what he gained. He simply confirms out loud to a police officer that locking a trusting friend in a bomb shelter and then a refrigerator for the better part of a week was a fair price to pay for one afternoon at his favorite restaurant. This is consistent with how Cartman behaves across almost every scheme he builds. The planning itself itself can be extensive and genuinely clever. The aftermath, when things go wrong, rarely produces guilt. It mostly produces some form of satisfaction that the plan, at least for a little while, worked exactly as intended. What connects Cherokee hair tampons and Casa Bonita to the far more disturbing events of Scott Tenorman Must Die is not the scale of harm involved, which is obviously very different across these 3 episodes. What connects them is the shape of Cartman's thinking. In every case, he identifies exactly what he wants. He identifies the specific obstacle standing between him and getting it, and he builds a plan that relies on predicting, often correctly, how other people around him will behave once certain information or certain fears are placed in front of them. Sometimes this planning is simple, like wearing a device to prevent theft while he sleeps. Sometimes it stretches out over days and requires constant adjustment, like relocating a frightened friend multiple times to avoid discovery. And in its most extreme form, it involves predicting the actions of nearly a dozen different people across several days in order to engineer a tragedy that looks, on the surface, like an accident no one could have seen coming. This pattern is part of why serious discussion of Cartman as a character tends to focus so heavily on his capacity to plan rather than simply his capacity to be cruel. Cruelty on its own is common in comedy. Plenty of characters across television history say mean things or act selfishly in the moment. What makes Cartman distinct, and what has kept people writing and talking about him for decades, is that his cruelty is so frequently paired with patience. He is willing to wait. He is willing to adjust. He is willing to sit through failure after failure, as seen across his repeated attempts to get invited to Casa Bonita, without abandoning the goal. The show gives him this quality consistently enough that it stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like a defining piece of who he actually is, underneath the jokes, the insults, and the constant demand for attention. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this planning happens in a vacuum, though. A child does not simply arrive with the ability to manipulate people this precisely without something shaping that ability along the way. And South Park does eventually turn its attention to exactly that question, looking closely at the one person who has been present for every single one of these schemes from the very beginning, watching them unfold from inside the same house and choosing again and again not to stop any of it. Section 4. The Enabling Mother. Every scheme Eric Cartman has ever built, from small ones over kidney donations to the elaborate revenge plot that ends with a bowl of chili, happens inside a home with exactly one adult in it. That adult is his mother, Leanne Cartman. She raises him alone. There is no father present in his daily life for most of the show's run, and for a long stretch of episodes, his actual parentage is treated as an ongoing joke rather than a real answer. What this means, in practical terms, is that Leanne is the only consistent authority figure Cartman has ever had at home, and the show eventually devotes an entire episode to examining exactly what kind of authority figure she actually is. That episode is called Tist. It aired on May 3rd, 2006 as the 7th episode of the show's 10th season, and it was written and directed by series co-creator Trey Parker. Unlike many episodes of the show, which juggle several storylines involving different characters at once, Tist stays almost entirely focused on one relationship, the one between Cartman and his mother, and what happens when someone finally tries to fix it using real methods rather than simply hoping the problem goes away on its own. The episode opens with Cartman and Leanne sitting in the office of Mr. Mackey, the school counselor, after Cartman has done something severe enough to require adult intervention. Cartman had told a classmate named Billy Turner, who had mocked him for being overweight, that he had poisoned his milk at lunch, and that the only way to reach the antidote in time was to saw through his own leg with a hacksaw, which Cartman had also handcuffed to a flagpole. Sitting across from Mackey, Leanne breaks down and admits something that the show had never stated so plainly before. She tells Mackey that she can no longer control her son. She is not exaggerating for effect or making an excuse. She is describing, in a school counselor's office, the honest state of her relationship with her only child. Mackey recommends she try seeking outside help, specifically pointing her toward reality television shows built around fixing badly behaved children. Leanne's first attempt at outside help comes from a nanny named Stella, modeled on a real television program about a nanny who visits households with unmanageable kids. Stella arrives at the Cartman house and immediately tries standard discipline, starting by taking away Cartman's video game console as a consequence for his behavior. Cartman does not respond to this the way an ordinary child might, with frustration or sulking. Instead, he begins asking Stella pointed personal questions about why she has no children of her own, eventually telling her directly that she is unattractive and that she will likely go through menopause before she ever finds a husband willing to have children with her. Stella, visibly shaken by by how precisely and coldly this 10-year-old boy has identified and attacked a personal insecurity, quits on the spot and refuses to continue working with him. The second attempt comes from a different nanny, modeled on another real reality show about parenting named Jo. The show never depicts exactly what Cartman does to her. It simply cuts ahead a short time later to reveal that Jo has ended up in a psychiatric hospital in a state of complete breakdown, repeating the same phrase over and over while in visible distress. The show deliberately withholds showing what specifically happened between them, which, if anything, makes the implication land harder. Whatever Cartman said or did to her was severe enough that the show's own writers chose not to depict it directly, relying instead on the aftermath to communicate the scale of the damage. At this point, a doctor treating the second nanny at the psychiatric hospital suggests one more option to Leanne, a dog trainer known professionally as the Dog Whisperer, played in the episode by the real dog trainer Cesar Millan, appearing as himself. This is where the episode shifts from simply cataloging Cartman's cruelty toward two well-meaning adults into something more specific and, in its own strange way, more clinical. Millan arrives at the house and immediately treats the situation differently than either of the previous two attempts. He does not try to reason with Cartman the way the nannies did. He does not attempt to appeal to him emotionally or negotiate with him. Instead, he explains to Leanne that Cartman is, in his professional assessment, behaving exactly like an aggressive, overfed, undisciplined dog. One that has been given far too many rewards and far too few limits for far too long. Millan's method involves treating Cartman almost exactly as he would treat a dog exhibiting dominant, aggressive behavior. He teaches Leanne a specific technique, a quick nip near the neck paired with a sharp sound meant to interrupt bad behavior the instant it happens, without lengthy explanation or negotiation. He refuses to speak to Cartman directly or acknowledge him by name, referring to him only as the child, explaining to Leanne that this lack of attention is itself part of the method, since Cartman has spent his entire life getting exactly what he wants by demanding attention, and removing that attention entirely denies him the one tool he has always relied on. He takes Cartman on a literal walk on a leash, the same way one might walk a dog that needs to learn who is in charge. Cartman's response to this is fury, though notably a different kind of fury than viewers have seen from him before. His usual tools do not work on Millan. His insults do not land because Millan simply does not react to them the way the nannies did. His attempts to fake obedience while secretly continuing his old behavior are caught almost immediately, since Millan is specifically trained to notice exactly this kind of deception. Frustrated and unable to find a way around the method, Cartman decides to run away from home entirely. He goes from friend to friend, asking Stan, Kyle, Kenny, Butters, and even Jimmy and Craig if he can stay with them. Every single one of them turns him down. None of his classmates are willing to take him in, even temporarily, which says something on its own about how thoroughly Cartman has burned through any real goodwill among the people around him. He ends up spending a night alone in an abandoned alley in the rain before finally returning home, having run out of any other option. What happens after he returns is the part of the episode most directly relevant to understanding Leanne's role in all of this. Under Millan's continued guidance, Cartman's behavior genuinely begins to change. He starts eating healthier meals instead of demanding junk food. He does his homework without being forced. He brushes his teeth when asked, something the episode frames as small but meaningful, since it shows him following a basic instruction without a fight for what appears to be the first time in his life. Leanne, watching all of this happen, seems both relieved and slightly unsettled by how effective this new, colder approach has been, compared to a decade of her own parenting. The episode does not end with this improvement. Once Cartman's behavior is under control, Millan tells Leanne that his work is essentially finished, and prepares to move on to help other families. Leanne, who has clearly grown attached to having him around, not simply as a professional helping her son, but as someone in her own life she has come to rely on, invites him to an outing, offering him tickets to see a performance together. Millan turns her down plainly, explaining that he sees her only as a client, nothing more, and that now that his work with Cartman is complete, there is no reason for him to continue coming by. This rejection visibly wounds Leanne. Rather than sitting with that disappointment or seeking support elsewhere, she turns immediately back to the one relationship she has always had available to her, the one with her son. She asks Cartman, the person she had previously described as someone she could no longer control, to spend time with her instead, and to make the offer appealing enough that he will say yes. She tells him he can have absolutely anything he wants in exchange. This moment is the entire episode collapsing back to where it started, in a single line of dialogue. Cartman, sensing an opening, asks if he could have two of whatever she is offering instead of one. Leanne agrees agrees immediately without hesitation, repeating that he can have whatever he wants. The episode's final shot shows Cartman's face settling into a small, satisfied, faintly unsettling smile as the two hug, with music playing in the background that deliberately echoes the tone used in a well-known horror film about a child with a dark and dangerous nature underneath an innocent surface. The message of that final image is not subtle. Everything that Milan had built over the course of the episode, real discipline, real consequences, real behavioral change, is undone in a matter of seconds. The moment Leanne's own emotional need for closeness with her son becomes stronger than her commitment to the boundaries that had just started working. It would be easy to watch this ending and simply laugh at the joke, since the entire episode is, on its surface, still a comedy built around exaggerated situations and absurd reality television parody. But the structure underneath the joke is worth taking seriously because it is not built loosely. Every step in this episode follows a clear line. A mother admits she cannot control her son. Two different professional methods, both built around emotional appeal and gentle correction, fail completely and end with both nannies suffering serious harm. A third method, built around firm boundaries and withdrawn attention, succeeds where the others could not. And the moment that method is removed, not because it stopped working, but because the adult responsible for maintaining it could not tolerate the emotional cost of consistency, the boy returns almost immediately to exactly who he was before any of it started. Matt Stone, one of the two creators of the show, has spoken about where the idea for this episode actually came from, and his explanation adds another layer to how deliberately this was constructed. Stone has said that as a dog owner himself, he was a genuine fan of the Real Dog Whisperer television program, and that the idea for this episode grew out of his own belief that the method Cesar Millan used on dogs would likely work just as well on an unmanageable child. This is not a small detail. It means the entire premise of the episode, treating a boy's behavior as something correctable through the same tools used to train an animal, that has been spoiled by too many rewards and too few limits, was not simply a random comedic idea. It was something one of the show's creators genuinely believed reflected a real truth about how consistent boundaries work, tested on a character who had spent nearly a decade on screen demonstrating exactly what happens when no one ever enforces any. Trey Parker, who wrote and directed the episode, has also spoken about his own reaction to the source material, saying in commentary released alongside the episode that the Real Dog Whisperer program was the only show on television that could actually move him to tears. That admission, coming from one of the two people responsible for creating one of the most consistently crude and irreverent shows in television history, says something about how sincerely this particular episode was approached, even while wrapped in the show's usual exaggeration and dark humor. When Cesar Millan himself was later asked whether he felt offended by how he was portrayed in the episode, he responded that he found the entire thing fantastic, and made a specific point of praising how carefully the writers had done their research into his actual methods before putting them into the mouth of an animated dog trainer treating a fictional 10-year-old boy. This detail matters because it confirms that the techniques shown in the episode were not invented for comedic exaggeration alone. They were an accurate representation of real methods, applied faithfully to a fictional situation, specifically designed to test what happens when those methods meet the single most difficult child the show's writers could imagine. What this episode leaves behind, once the jokes settle and the plot resolves, is a fairly direct statement about where at least part of Cartman's behavior comes from. Not all of it. The show never suggests that better parenting alone would have prevented everything he has done or will go on to do. But it does suggest, plainly and without much room for a different reading, that the one adult responsible for raising him has never been able to hold a boundary long enough for it to matter, and that the one time someone else briefly succeeded in holding that boundary for her, she chose her own comfort over keeping it in place. The episode does not ask viewers to feel sorry for Cartman. It asks them to notice that the adult who was supposed to stop any of this from happening in the first place has every single time it counted chosen not to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is a specific reason this particular ending, rather than any of the chaos that comes before it, is the part of the episode that critics and viewers keep returning to when they talk about what it actually reveals. It has less to do with what failed, and more to do with exactly what kind of failure it was. Section 5. What TSST says about learned behavior. The previous section walked through how the episode TSST begins and ends, showing a mother who cannot control her son, 3 different attempts to fix that, and a final collapse back into the same pattern the moment real discipline became emotionally inconvenient for her to keep enforcing. What that section did not cover in full detail is what happens in the middle of the episode. During during the period when Cesar Millan's methods are actually working on Cartman, and specifically what Cartman himself does once he realizes he can no longer manipulate his way out of the situation. That middle stretch of the episode is where the show gets closest to answering a real question. Is Cartman simply born this way, unable to change no matter what happens around him, or is at least some of his behavior something he learned? Something that can be temporarily undone under the right conditions, and just as easily rebuilt the moment those conditions disappear. Once Cartman returns home after his night spent alone in the rain, having failed to find a single friend willing to take him in, something in him shifts. This shift is shown gradually rather than all at once. At first, he continues to test the boundaries Millan has set, trying small acts of defiance to see whether the new system will hold. Each time, Millan or Leon respond with the same firm correction, a quick nip near the neck paired with the same sharp sound without any lengthy explanation, argument, or emotional appeal. There is no negotiation offered, which matters because negotiation had always been the exact tool Cartman relied on to get his way in every previous conflict shown across the series. Take away the negotiation and take away the audience of adults willing to argue with him, and Cartman is left with nothing familiar to grab onto. Slowly, the show depicts real behavioral change. Leon comes downstairs one morning to find Cartman already awake, dressed, doing his own homework without being told, and eating a full, healthy breakfast he prepared for himself. None of these things had ever been shown happening in the series before this episode. Even small routine tasks like brushing his teeth, something most children do automatically without thinking about it, had previously required constant fighting and negotiation with Cartman. In this stretch of the episode, he simply does it, following his mother's instruction the moment it is given, without argument. The show frames this quietly, almost matter of fact, letting the absence of conflict speak for itself rather than drawing attention to it with a big dramatic moment. This is the part of the episode that matters most for understanding what kind of person Cartman actually is underneath everything else. If his cruelty and manipulation were simply fixed traits, permanent parts of him with no relationship to his environment, none of this change should have been possible under any circumstances. A person with no capacity for different behavior does not suddenly start doing homework and eating vegetables because someone made a sharp sound near his neck a few times. But Cartman does change, and the change is shown as real within the world of the episode, not faked or temporary in the moment it happens. This suggests that at least part of what makes Cartman act the way he normally does is not some unchangeable core trait, but something closer to a habit built and reinforced over years of getting away with exactly the kind of behavior that habit produces. What happens next in the episode complicates this simple, hopeful reading considerably. As Cartman's good behavior continues, his mother, following Millan's continued advice, moves the household toward a healthier and more disciplined routine. One evening, she serves a dinner built around this new approach, and Cartman, sitting in front of it, reacts with disgust and anger. He tells her the meal reminds him of Auschwitz, referring to one of the most notorious concentration camps used during the Holocaust. This comparison is jarring, deliberately so, and it marks the moment where Cartman's frustration with the new structure in his life starts finding an outlet through the same prejudice that has defined so much of his character elsewhere on the show. He continues building on this comparison privately, telling himself that since he has recently lost some weight under the new household rules, he now understands, in his own mind, what it must have felt like to be a Jewish person suffering during the Holocaust. He compares his mother's newfound discipline directly to Adolf Hitler, treating a bedtime routine and a healthier diet as something on the scale of one of history's worst atrocities. This comparison is not simply an offensive joke thrown in for shock value. It reveals something specific about how Cartman processes losing control over any part of his life. Rather than sitting with frustration or expressing it directly, or even simply complaining the way an ordinary child might, his mind reaches immediately for the most extreme available comparison, one that trivializes real historical suffering in order to describe his own minor inconvenience. This same pattern, reaching for wildly disproportionate comparisons to justify his own feelings, shows up elsewhere across the series as well, and it says something important about how little proportion or perspective Cartman brings to situations that genuinely upset him, even when those situations involve nothing more serious than being asked to eat a healthier meal. From this point, Cartman's frustration escalates into something far more serious than a complaint. He decides, privately, that the only way to regain control over his own life is to kill his mother. He approaches his other friends first, trying to recruit help for this plan, comparing Leanne's new discipline once again to the Holocaust, in an attempt to convince them to join him. Every one of his friends refuses. None of them are willing to help him harm his own mother, regardless of how frustrated he claims to be with her new parenting approach. approach. Undeterred, Cartman decides to carry out the plan alone. He goes to his mother's room carrying a knife and paper towels, clearly having thought through, at least briefly, what he intends to do and what he might need in order to do it. What happens next is the strangest and most revealing sequence in the entire episode. As Cartman stands there, apparently on the verge of acting on this plan, something inside him stops him. The episode shows this moment through a strange, disturbing physical sequence, where Cartman vomits a dark black substance and appears to go through some kind of internal struggle, his body twisting and shifting in the hallway outside his mother's room, almost as though something inside him is being forced out against its will. After this sequence ends, he collapses, and the knife is left behind, unused. The following morning, his mother finds the knife, but also finds her son already awake, dressed, having made his own healthy breakfast, and sitting down to study before school, seemingly with no memory of, or comment on, what almost happened the night before. This sequence is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing purely as shock comedy, because of what it suggests about where Cartman's cruelty actually lives inside him. The episode frames this internal struggle almost as if something separate from Cartman, some darker impulse living inside him, was trying to push him toward killing his mother, and that impulse was, at least this once, defeated by something else inside him, something the show never fully explains, that refused to let the act happen. Whether this is meant to represent an actual conscience buried somewhere underneath years of learned selfishness, or something else entirely, the show leaves this open. What it does make clear is that Cartman, even at what appears to be his very lowest and most dangerous point in this particular episode, does not go through with the act. He stops. Something in him refuses to finish what he set out to do. This matters enormously for understanding the argument the episode as a whole seems to be making about learned behavior. A child who is simply born without any capacity for restraint, without any internal check on his own worst impulses, would have no reason to stop himself in a moment like this. Cartman does stop, even after building toward the act for the length of an entire evening, even after failing to recruit help and choosing to proceed alone anyway. This suggests that whatever exists inside Cartman that resists doing real, permanent, irreversible harm to another person, even a person he has just spent an entire evening comparing to a historical monster in his own head, is still present and still capable of winning out, at least under specific circumstances, at least once. The episode does not spend much time celebrating this moment or treating it as a triumphant turning point. It moves past it quickly, back toward its final scenes, where Milan prepares to leave, Leanne is rejected by him personally, and she turns back to Cartman for the emotional companionship she is missing, offering him anything he wants in exchange for spending time with her. And this return to old patterns is exactly what makes the entire structure of the episode function as a complete argument, rather than a simple morality tale with an easy lesson at the end. Cartman was capable of real change. He was capable even of resisting his own worst impulse at what may have been the darkest point the show had shown him reach up to that point in the series. But none of that change was self-sustaining. It required an outside structure, consistent boundaries enforced by someone else, held in place without negotiation or emotional appeal. The instant that structure disappeared, replaced once again by his mother's old habit of giving him anything he wanted the moment she needed something emotionally from him in return, Cartman returned to exactly who he had always been, smiling faintly at the camera as the episode closes. This raises a question that the show itself never directly answers, but that the episode leaves sitting clearly in front of anyone paying attention. If real change was possible, even briefly, under the right conditions, how much of Cartman's ordinary behavior across the rest of the series is something closer to a learned response to a lifetime of getting away with things, rather than some fixed, unchangeable part of who he is? The episode does not claim Cartman could have been fixed permanently if only his mother had held the line a little longer. It also does not claim the opposite, that nothing could have ever worked no matter how consistent the structure around him had been. It simply shows, plainly and without much comment, what happened during the one stretch of the show where someone actually tried a different approach, and what happened the moment that approach was abandoned. Cesar Millan, in his own comments about the episode after it aired, praised how carefully the writers had researched his actual methods before adapting them for a fictional child. This detail matters again here, because it means the improvement shown in Cartman during this stretch of the episode was not an exaggerated cartoon joke about discipline working through magic. It was built to reflect real methods that Milan uses professionally, applied faithfully to a fictional situation. The writers were not simply inventing a fantasy where any structure at all would have fixed Cartman. They were showing a specific, real approach, one built around consistency and withdrawn attention rather than negotiation actually working, for a while, on the single most difficult child the show had ever created. What the episode leaves behind, once all of this is considered together, is a far more complicated picture of Cartman than his usual on-screen cruelty tends to suggest. He is not shown as a boy incapable of behaving differently. He is shown as a boy who has simply never had consistent reason to. The one time consistency was introduced into his life, even temporarily and even through unconventional means, real change followed, including, at its most extreme moment, an internal refusal to go through with an act of real violence against his own mother. And the one time that consistency disappeared, so did every trace of the change it had produced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same question, whether Cartman's behavior comes from something fixed inside him or something built and reinforced by the people and circumstances around him, becomes even more complicated once the show finally reveals who his real father actually is, and what that man's death years earlier at Cartman's own hand ends up meaning for both of them. Section 6. The father he never knew he killed. For the first 13 seasons of South Park, one question sat unanswered in the background of the show, occasionally brought up as a joke and then dropped again without resolution. Who is Eric Cartman's father? This question first appeared as far back as the show's very first season finale, where the show promised, through its own storytelling, to reveal the answer. It did not. Instead, the finale ended on a cliffhanger, and rather than resolving it, the show followed up with an entire episode built around a completely unrelated storyline involving two other characters, seemingly trolling its own audience for wanting an answer. When the show finally did return to the subject in its second season, in an episode called Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, the mystery only grew stranger. That episode revealed that Cartman's mother, Leanne, was secretly intersex, meaning she possessed both male and female biological traits, and the show framed this in a way that suggested she was, quite literally, both Cartman's mother and his father at the same time. This explanation, strange as it was, became something the show treated as settled canon for well over a decade. Then, 10 years later, the show returned to this same subject again, and this time it revealed that the entire hermaphrodite explanation had been a lie from the very beginning, one deliberately constructed and maintained by the entire town of South Park. This reveal happened across two connected episodes, titled 200 and 201, which together marked the 200th episode of the series overall. These episodes aired in April 2010 as part of the show's 14th season, and were written and directed by series co-creator Trey Parker. The premise of these two episodes is enormous in scale, involving a large group of celebrities the show had mocked over the years, banding together to demand an object with special powers from a figure connected to the Prophet Muhammad, threatening violence against the entire town if their demands are not met. Buried inside this chaotic, sprawling storyline is a much smaller, much more personal thread, one that had been sitting quietly in the show's history for almost a decade without most viewers realizing it was ever there at all. In 200, it is finally revealed that Leanne Cartman is not, and never was, intersex. The entire story had been fabricated by the town years earlier in order to protect a specific secret. In 201, the second half of this two-part story, that secret is finally revealed directly to Cartman himself. His real biological father is a man named Jack Tinnerman. Jack Tinnerman had once played professional football for the Denver Broncos, and years earlier he had an affair with Leanne. When Leanne became pregnant, the entire town, motivated by a desire to protect the Broncos from a scandal during a particularly successful season for the team, agreed to cover up the truth. Rather than let it become public that one of their players had fathered a child outside of his marriage, the town collectively decided to alter the results of paternity testing and invent the story that Leanne herself was intersex, and therefore both of Cartman's biological parents. This lie was maintained deliberately by nearly everyone in South Park for the entire length of Cartman's life up to this point in the show. The reveal of Jack Tinnerman's identity as Cartman's father carries a specific weight that has nothing to do with football or small town scandal, and everything to do with an episode that had aired nearly a decade earlier. Jack Tinnerman is not a new character invented for this reveal. He is the father of Scott Tinnerman, the same boy at the center of Scott Tinnerman Must Die, the episode discussed earlier in this analysis, as the moment Cartman's writing shifted from bratty child to something closer to a calculated, patient adversary. Jack Tinnerman was one of the two people killed by Farmer Denkins in that earlier episode, after Cartman engineered a situation designed to make Denkins believe Scott's parents were dangerous trespassers trespassers intent on harming him. Jack Tinnerman's body, along with his wife's, was the one Cartman spent an entire night cutting into pieces in order to prepare the chili he later fed to Scott at the chili cooking contest, revealing what he had done only after Scott had already eaten it. This means the reveal in 201 does something that very few pieces of television manage to do convincingly. It reaches backward almost a decade into the show's own history and completely changes the meaning of an episode that had already been finished, aired, discussed, ranked, and celebrated as one of the greatest episodes the show had ever produced. Every viewer who had watched Scott Tinnerman Must Die before 201 aired had watched Cartman orchestrate the deaths of two strangers, people with no established connection to him beyond being the parents of a boy who had scammed him out of $16. After 201, those same two people are revealed to have included Cartman's own biological father, a man Cartman had spent years of his life wondering about, joking about, and occasionally expressing real curiosity toward, without ever knowing that he had already met him, briefly, on the worst night of that man's life, and had already ensured his death before ever learning who he was. The scene in which this reveal actually happens inside 201 adds another layer of significance to it. Scott Tinnerman, who disappeared from the show for years after the events of the original episode, returns as an adult character, revealed to have spent months in a mental institution in the years following his parents' deaths and his unknowing act of eating them. During that time, Scott had become consumed with researching Cartman's history, eventually discovering the truth about Jack Tinnerman's identity as Cartman's father, information the rest of the town had worked hard to keep hidden. Scott, now leading a group in the show called the Ginger Separatist Movement, made up of red-haired, freckled children who had also once been targets of Cartman's prejudice, brings Cartman before this group specifically to reveal the truth to him in the cruelest way possible, telling him directly that the man Cartman had killed years earlier, without ever knowing his name at the time, had been his own father, and that Scott, the person Cartman had tormented so elaborately, was in fact his half-brother. What Cartman does with this information in the moment it is revealed to him is worth examining closely, because it says something specific and consistent about how his mind processes information that would devastate almost anyone else. He does not react with grief over having unknowingly caused his own father's death. He does not react with horror at having fed his father's remains to another human being, even unknowingly. Instead, according to how the episode plays this moment, Cartman's overwhelming emotional reaction centers entirely on a different piece of the revelation: the fact that being half Tinnerman also makes him half Ginger, meaning he is now, by his own long-held standards, one of the very people he had spent years mocking and excluding. He is shown crying over this specific detail, distressed about his own connection to a group he had targeted with prejudice, seemingly untouched by the actual weight of what happened to his biological father. It is only when Cartman's hand puppet persona, a separate character he sometimes uses named Mitch Connor, reminds him that he is also half Denver Bronco, tying his identity back to a source of pride rather than shame, that Cartman's crying stops and he calms down completely. This detail, more than almost anything else revealed across these two episodes, tells you something precise about how consistently the show has built Cartman's inner priorities. Presented with the fact that he indirectly caused his own father's death, and then unknowingly fed that father to another child, his emotional response skips past any grief or guilt entirely and lands instead on a completely different concern: his own status within a group he has spent years disparaging. Even in a moment built specifically to shock him with information about his own identity and his own past actions, the thing that actually breaks through and affects him is not the horror of what he did. It is a shallow, self-focused worry about his own social standing, resolved the instant he is offered a different, more flattering way to understand himself instead. This pattern connects directly back to everything established in earlier sections of this analysis. Cartman's schemes, from small ones over kidney donations to the elaborate patient plot against Scott Tinnerman, have always been built around achieving something he personally wants, with very little regard for the cost to the people around him. What 200 and 201 reveal is that this same lack of regard extends even to information about his own biological father, a man he spent years wondering about, a man he unknowingly killed, and a man whose death, once fully explained to him, produces almost no visible emotional reaction beyond a brief concern about his own reputation. Even when the story circles back around to directly implicate Cartman in something as serious as causing his own parents' death, the show does not use this moment to soften him or humanize him in the way such a reveal might in a different kind of story. It uses the moment to demonstrate, one more time, just how narrow and self-centered his emotional world actually is, even under the weight of information this heavy. There is also something worth noting about how deliberately this reveal was constructed across such a long stretch of time. Jack Tennerman was not simply invented as Cartman's father the moment the writers needed a twist for the 200th episode. He had already existed as a character for nearly a decade, appearing specifically as Scott Tennerman's father in the original 2001 episode, given a name, a profession, and a specific memorable death. The show's decision to return to this exact character years later and reveal an entirely new layer to who he had been all along shows a level of long-term planning in the writing itself that mirrors, in a strange way, the same kind of patient, forward-looking planning the show has always given to Cartman as a character. Just as Cartman spent an entire episode setting up dominoes that would only fall into place days later, the show's own writers appear to have left a piece of information sitting quietly in the background of an old episode, fully formed and ready to be used for almost 10 years, before finally revealing why it mattered all along. The practical result of this reveal is that Scott Tennerman, once simply a one-episode antagonist who tricked Cartman out of a small amount of money and paid an unthinkable price for it, becomes something much more permanent in the show's history. He is Cartman's half-brother, a fact that does not disappear once the 200th episode ends. This connection recontextualizes their entire original conflict retroactively. What had once looked like an ordinary childhood dispute escalating into something monstrous now reads as something closer to two half-brothers, unaware of their relationship to each other, destroying each other's lives over a matter of $16, with one of them unknowingly orchestrating the death of the very man who connects them years before either boy understood what that connection actually meant. It is worth being clear that none of this changes what actually happened in the earlier episode. Cartman did not know Jack Tennerman was his father when he engineered his death. This was not an act of intentional patricide. It was an act of intentional, elaborate revenge against a stranger who happened, without either boy's knowledge at the time, to be connected to both of them by blood. But the retroactive weight of this discovery is still real, and it changes how the original episode functions within the larger story of who Cartman is. It adds a layer of dark, unintentional irony to an already disturbing story, and it demonstrates, through the show's own long-term planning, just how carefully constructed Cartman's world has always been, even when the full picture of that construction only becomes visible years after the fact. What remains constant across both the original episode and this much later reveal is Cartman's complete inability to process consequence in any way resembling how most people would. He does not carry guilt forward from what he did to Scott Tennerman's parents. He does not carry grief forward once he learns one of those parents was his own father. In both cases, his attention moves quickly past the actual tragedy and lands instead on whatever detail affects him personally in the moment. His own victory in the original episode, his own social status in the reveal a decade later. This consistency, stretched across nearly 10 years of the show's real-world broadcast history, is part of what makes Cartman such a difficult character to write off as simply a cartoon villain existing purely for shock value. The show keeps returning to him, keeps building on what came before, and keeps confirming, through entirely new stories built around entirely new information, that the same core pattern holds no matter how much time passes or how much new context gets added to his history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more place where this exact pattern, real emotional stakes met with almost no lasting change in Cartman's behavior, gets tested even more directly than anything discussed so far. It happens years later in a relationship that lasts an entire season with a girl named Heidi Turner, and what happens to her over the course of that relationship shows exactly what it looks like when Cartman's patience and planning are turned for the first time towards someone he claims to genuinely care about. Section 7. Manipulation as relationship structure. Heidi Turner. For 19 seasons, Eric Cartman had no real romantic relationships on South Park. He had schemes, feuds, and elaborate revenge plots, but nothing resembling an actual girlfriend. That changed in the show's 20th season, which began airing in September 2016, when a classmate named Heidi Turner became one of the most important characters in the show for an extended stretch of episodes. Heidi had existed as a minor background character for years before this, occasionally appearing in group scenes with the other girls in class, but she had never been given much focus of her own. Season 20 changed that entirely, and what happened to her over the course of that season and the one that followed gives one of the clearest, most sustained examples in the entire show of what Cartman's patience and planning look like when aimed at someone he claims to actually love. The relationship begins under circumstances that, at first, make Cartman look almost sympathetic. During season 20, an anonymous online account calling itself SkankHunt42 begins harassing women throughout the town, posting cruel, sexually explicit messages aimed specifically at them. Heidi becomes one of the account's targets, and the harassment affects her badly enough that she deletes her social media entirely, throwing her phone into a river in a dramatic public gesture. Around the same time, it becomes known that Cartman himself was the person behind the SkankHunt42 account the entire time, something several other characters suspect but cannot immediately prove. Despite this, Heidi and Cartman end up bonding with each other during this period, both of them having lost access to their phones and social media, both of them isolated from the wider world in similar ways. From this shared isolation, they become boyfriend and girlfriend, and for a stretch of episodes, the show presents their relationship as something genuinely warm. They use affectionate nicknames for each other, they are shown being physically affectionate, and Heidi even sings with Cartman during this early period, something that had never been part of his character before. This early stretch of the relationship matters for understanding everything that comes afterward, because it is not framed as fake from the very beginning. The show does not suggest Cartman was scheming from day one the way he clearly was in episodes like Scott Tenorman Must Die or Casa Bonita. For a period of time spanning the end of season 20, the relationship appears to function as something real, at least on the surface. This makes what happens next even more significant, because it shows a shift in Cartman's behavior over time, rather than a plan he was executing from the very start. That shift becomes visible almost immediately once season 21 begins, in an episode called White People Renovating Houses, which functions as the first chapter in an ongoing storyline about the health of Heidi and Cartman's relationship. In this episode, Cartman begins acting distant and passive-aggressive toward Heidi without explaining why. When she visits his house, he barely engages with her, annoying her enough that she leaves upset, frustrated that he refuses to communicate what is actually bothering him. Later that night, when Heidi calls him to point out an inconsistency in something he had said earlier about phones, Cartman hangs up on her, clearly annoyed, offering only a cold good night before ending the call. What follows this exchange is the detail that most clearly marks the beginning of a different kind of pattern in their relationship. Cartman tells his male friends that Heidi changes unpredictably, comparing her to a well-known fictional character who transforms from a kind person into a violent one without warning, and claims that she mentally abuses him and needs professional help. The show makes clear to the audience, through everything shown in the episode itself, that none of these claims about Heidi are true. Heidi has not been shown doing anything resembling what Cartman describes to his friends. What the show is depicting instead is Cartman describing his own withdrawn, cold behavior as coming from her, presenting himself as the victim of a relationship where he was actually the one causing the initial harm. This pattern deepens across the season. In an episode called Sons of Witches, aired as part of the show's Halloween special that year, the growing tension between the two of them is shown continuing during what should be a simple outing to a pumpkin patch. Heidi takes longer than Cartman wants to get ready, and rather than simply expressing mild impatience, Cartman becomes visibly upset with her over it. Heidi, noticing his mood, tries to check in with him, asking directly if something is bothering him, showing the kind of attentiveness and concern that had defined her character even before the relationship began. The show consistently frames Heidi during this period as someone genuinely trying to understand and support her boyfriend, even as his behavior toward her grows colder and more controlling. The most detailed and disturbing chapter of this storyline appears in an episode called Doubling Down, which aired on November 8th, 2017 as the 7th episode of season 21. By this point in the season, Cartman's treatment of Heidi has become openly cruel in ways he no longer bothers to hide from his friends, even while he continues acting affectionately toward Heidi whenever she is actually present. The episode opens with Cartman blaming his own anger problems on his diet, which leads Heidi, hoping this might actually help him, to convince him to try a plant-based diet together with her, as a way of trying to repair the relationship. The next day, Cartman continues speaking about Heidi to the other boys in openly degrading terms, mocking her behind her back, while switching immediately into a warmer, kinder version of himself the moment she actually appears at their lunch table. This contrast, cruelty in her absence and affection in her presence, becomes one of the clearest patterns defining how Cartman treats her throughout this entire storyline. Later in the same episode, Cartman brings Heidi a large bucket of fried chicken, telling her it is a specific brand of plant-based fried chicken meant to fit the diet the two of of them had agreed to try together. This is a lie. It is ordinary fried chicken, and Cartman knows this. Heidi, trusting him, eats it, and soon after begins feeling unusually bloated and unwell. Rather than telling her the truth or expressing any concern for how she feels, Cartman instead begins mocking her behind her back to the other boys, telling them that she is getting fat, the exact outcome he had engineered by deceiving her about what she was eating in the first place. This sequence, deceiving someone into eating something that will cause the very physical change he then mocks them for, mirrors the same kind of patient, multi-step planning that defined Cartman's earlier schemes against Scott Tenorman and Butters. Except this time, the target is someone he claims to care about, and the harm being engineered is aimed directly at her body and her sense of herself. Around this same period, one of Cartman's own friends, Kyle, becomes increasingly troubled by what he is witnessing. Kyle goes to speak with Heidi directly about her relationship, and when she becomes defensive and avoids the subject, he does not immediately push further. Instead, Kyle goes to speak with the other girls at school, asking them to stop mocking Heidi over her relationship with Cartman, recognizing correctly that the teasing she receives from her friends only pushes her to defend the relationship more stubbornly rather than question it. Kyle eventually talks with Heidi again in private, this time telling her plainly that none of what is happening in her relationship is her fault, and that Cartman is simply the way he is. This conversation affects Heidi enough that she begins reflecting seriously on the relationship, and shortly afterwards, she decides to end things with Cartman. What follows shows how far Cartman is willing to go once he senses he is actually losing control of the situation. As Heidi begins spending more time with Kyle, and the two of them start developing feelings for each other, Cartman finds out and reacts immediately. He first attempts to physically fight Kyle at school over it, a confrontation Kyle wins with a single punch. When that fails to resolve the situation in his favor, Cartman shifts tactics entirely. Rather than continuing to confront Kyle directly, he focuses his efforts on Heidi instead, working to convince her that Kyle has been the one manipulating her all along, twisting the situation until Heidi becomes convinced that she has been wronged not by Cartman, but by the person who had actually tried to help her see the relationship clearly. Heidi ultimately breaks up with Kyle and returns to Cartman, feeling guilty for having ever doubted him in the first place. This reversal is one of the clearest examples in the entire show of Cartman successfully rewriting a situation so completely that the person who tried to help gets blamed instead of the person who caused the actual harm. Kyle, who had done nothing throughout this storyline except express genuine concern for a classmate being treated poorly, ends up heartbroken and resentful, watching Heidi return to exactly the relationship he had tried to help her leave. Cartman, meanwhile, faces no real consequence for any of it. He gets exactly what he wanted, Heidi back under his influence, and the person who threatened that outcome pushed out of the picture entirely, not through force, but through Cartman successfully convincing Heidi to see things his way. The season's storyline reaches its most severe point in an episode that shows how far Cartman is willing to go once Heidi, at a later point, tries once again to leave the relationship for good. Rather than accepting this, Cartman begs her not to leave, and when begging alone does not seem to be working, he threatens to kill himself if she goes through with the breakup. Heidi, despite everything she has already experienced in the relationship, still cares about him enough that this threat affects her deeply, and she continues to insist to others that he is fundamentally a good person, even as the pattern of harm around her continues to grow. This threat of self-harm as a way of preventing someone from leaving a relationship is one of the most serious things the show has ever depicted Cartman doing, precisely because it is aimed not at gaining something for himself through cleverness or deception, but at controlling another person's choices by making his own safety her responsibility. Over the course of these episodes, the show also depicts something else worth noting directly: a gradual change in who Heidi becomes as a person the longer she stays in this relationship. Before dating Cartman, Heidi is shown across many earlier seasons as one of the kinder, more thoughtful characters among the girls at school. Someone who treats people fairly even when they are not part of her usual social circle. As the relationship with Cartman continues, this begins to shift. She becomes increasingly unkind, increasingly focused on trivial complaints, and increasingly willing to mock and belittle people around her, including Kyle, the same person who had once tried to help her see the relationship clearly. This change is shown gradually across multiple episodes, tracking alongside the length of time she spends with Cartman, rather than happening all at once. What makes this storyline so significant within any serious study of Cartman's psychology is that it takes the exact same tools already established across earlier episodes of the show: patience, planning, the ability to correctly predict how another person will react to specific information, and applies them to a relationship rather than a scheme. In Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman predicted how his friends, a farmer, and a grieving teenager would each react react to carefully placed information and built an entire plot around those predictions. In the Heidi Turner storyline, he applies that same predictive skill towards someone who trusts him completely, someone who has chosen to stay with him specifically because she believes, despite everything happening around her, that he is fundamentally good underneath his flaws. Rather than using his understanding of how she thinks to support or care for her, he uses it to keep her attached to him, to turn her against people trying to help her, and to make sure that whenever she tries to leave, he has some tool available, guilt, false blame directed at someone else, or, in the most severe moment, the threat of his own death, ready to pull her back. This entire storyline unfolds not across a single episode, but across the better part of 2 full seasons, giving it a scale and duration that almost none of Cartman's earlier schemes were given. The slow, gradual nature of how Heidi's own personality shifts, matched against Cartman's own pattern of cruelty hidden behind affection whenever she is actually present, gives this particular chapter of the show a weight that feels different from the more cartoonish extremes of something like the Scott Tenorman storyline. There is no Chili, no farmer, no elaborate revenge plot resolved in a single episode. There is simply a boy who has already been shown again and again to be capable of extraordinary patience in service of getting exactly what he wants, applying that same patience to a person who loves him for month after month, episode after episode, until she is no longer quite the same person she was before she met him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That change in Heidi, the slow drift from someone kind and thoughtful into someone who mirrors many of Cartman's own worst qualities, does not stop once this particular season ends. It continues into later episodes, and it eventually becomes clear that Cartman himself, watching what she has become, is not entirely comfortable with what his own influence has produced. Section 8. The Mirroring Effect. The previous section ended with Heidi Turner slowly becoming a different person over the course of her relationship with Eric Cartman. This section looks closely at exactly how far that change goes, because South Park does not simply hint at this transformation in passing. It builds an entire sequence of episodes around showing Heidi turning, piece by piece, into something close to a copy of the same boy who spent the better part of 2 seasons manipulating her. By the time the show reaches an episode called Moss Piglets, deep in its 21st season, Heidi has changed enough that the episode treats her as its main source of conflict rather than Cartman himself. She has gained a significant amount of weight, largely as a result of the deception described in the previous section, where Cartman tricked her into eating regular fried chicken disguised as a plant-based alternative. But the change goes well beyond her physical appearance. The show depicts her becoming lazier, louder, and far more openly unkind to people around her than she had ever been before entering this relationship. She is shown eating junk food constantly, spending long stretches of time simply watching television rather than engaging in anything else, and making excuses to avoid doing her own schoolwork, sometimes pushing that work onto other students instead. Each of these behaviors is something the show had already spent years establishing as core parts of Cartman's own personality. Watching Heidi pick them up one by one is not subtle, and it does not appear to be accidental on the part of the writers. What makes this transformation land with real weight, rather than simply reading as a joke about weight gain, is how directly the show ties it back to specific choices Cartman made. He is the one who deceived her about what she was eating. He is the one who spent months modeling exactly this kind of laziness and cruelty in front of her, day after day, as part of an ordinary relationship she believed she was building with someone who cared about her. The show does not present Heidi's change as something that simply happened to her by chance. It presents it as something Cartman built, the same way he built the elaborate plan against Scott Tenorman, or the meteor story used to trap Butters. Except this time, the target of the plan was someone who trusted him completely, and the result was not a single afternoon of chaos, but a lasting change to who she actually was. The show goes further than simply showing this change happen. It shows Cartman himself reacting to what he created, and his reaction is genuinely revealing. Rather than being satisfied or proud of having reshaped Heidi into someone more like himself, the show depicts him as visibly unhappy with the outcome. He finds himself now dealing with a girlfriend who is loud, demanding, lazy, and difficult in exactly the ways he used to be, and he does not enjoy being on the receiving end of those same qualities. Despite this discomfort, Cartman does not attempt to end the relationship or address what he has done. Instead, the show depicts him becoming increasingly desperate to hold on to Heidi, regardless of how unpleasant their dynamic has become, seemingly out of fear that letting her go would leave him alone again, a fear that outweighs whatever whatever frustration he feels about the person she has turned into. This dynamic escalates further in an episode called Super Hard PC-ness, where the relationship between Cartman and Heidi has deteriorated to the point where the two of them settle minor disagreements through physical fights with each other, something the other students at school find entertaining enough to gather around and watch. This detail matters because it shows how completely the relationship has shifted away from anything resembling its early affectionate beginning back in season 20. What started with pet names, singing together, and public displays of comfort during a shared moment of isolation has turned into something closer to a rivalry. Two people locked into repeated conflict, each one seemingly unable or unwilling to simply walk away from the other. Kyle, watching this dynamic play out at school, is the one character who consistently tries to intervene, at one point stepping in to stop a fight when Cartman and Heidi turn on him together after he attempts to talk them out of resorting to violence in the first place. An episode called Franchise Prequel, occurring around this same period, shows a smaller but equally telling moment in the relationship. While Cartman is in the middle of giving his friends a motivational speech in his separate identity as a costumed vigilante called the Coon, Heidi approaches him and simply asks what he has been doing. The moment causes Cartman to visibly deflate, losing whatever confident energy he had just been projecting to his friends. She then asks if he still wants to follow through on previously made plans to go to the park together, and when he responds to her with the same passive-aggressive coldness that had defined the earlier stretch of their relationship, she cancels their plans and leaves. This scene is brief, but it shows that even during periods when Heidi herself has changed considerably, she is still, at moments, capable of noticing when Cartman is being dishonest or evasive with her, and still willing to hold him accountable for it in small ways, even if larger patterns in the relationship remain unresolved. The relationship reaches a breaking point in an episode called Splatty Tomato, which functions as part of the season's finale. By this point, a specific narrative device appears in the show, a kind of ghost or vision representing the version of Heidi that existed before she ever started dating Cartman. This earlier version of herself appears to try to help the present-day Heidi recognize exactly how much she has changed, and exactly what she has lost in the process. The ghost succeeds in getting through to her. Heidi, confronted directly with a vision of who she used to be, before the weight gain, before the cruelty, before the constant fighting with someone she once thought loved her, finally understands the full scope of what has happened to her over the course of this relationship. Her reaction to this realization is immediate and severe. She picks up a gun and points it directly at Cartman, intending to use it against him as a form of revenge for what he has done to her. Before she can act on this, Cartman moves quickly, knocking the gun out of her hand and then turning it on himself instead, declaring that he will kill himself if she goes through with ending the relationship. This moment mirrors almost exactly the threat described in the previous section, where Cartman had already used the possibility of his own death as a tool to prevent Heidi from leaving him earlier in the season. Rather than this tactic losing its effectiveness after using it once already, the show returns to it again at the exact moment when the relationship reaches what appears to be its most dangerous point, using the same threat as a kind of final defense against losing control over her entirely. The episode, and the entire season along with it, ends on this exact moment, unresolved. The show does not clarify within this stretch of episodes whether Cartman actually goes through with anything, whether Heidi backs down out of concern for him, or whether the relationship truly ends there. What matters most for understanding Cartman's psychology is not how the specific plot resolves, but the fact that his final tool, once every other method of control has been exhausted, once manipulation, deception, blame shifting, and physical conflict have all been tried and have all eventually failed to keep Heidi fully under his influence, is the threat of harming himself. This is not a tool aimed at winning an argument or gaining something material. It is a tool aimed directly at Heidi's own sense of responsibility for his well-being, forcing her to weigh her own need to leave an unhealthy relationship against the fear of what might happen to him if she does. Taken together, the full arc of this relationship, stretching from its warm beginning in season 20 through its steady decline across season 21, offers one of the clearest, most sustained pictures the show has ever given of what happens when Cartman's particular combination of patience, planning, and total lack of concern for consequence gets applied not to a stranger like Scott Tenorman, and not to a trusting friend like Butters, but to someone he has chosen to keep close to him for an extended period of time. The show does not soften this portrayal or suggest that Cartman changes for the better because he is in a relationship. If anything, it uses the length and intimacy of the relationship to demonstrate just how far his influence can reach when given enough time and enough access to someone's daily life. Heidi does not simply tolerate a few bad qualities qualities in her boyfriend. She is shown gradually absorbing those qualities into her own personality, becoming, for a significant stretch of episodes, something close to a second version of the exact person who reshaped her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises a question worth sitting with directly. Across every relationship examined so far in this analysis, whether with a stranger, a trusting friend, his own mother, or a girlfriend who genuinely believed she loved him, the pattern holds remarkably steady. Cartman identifies what he wants, predicts how the people around him will respond to specific pressures or specific information, and adjusts his approach until he gets it, regardless of the cost to anyone standing in his way. What remains less examined is where this specific combination of traits actually comes from in the first place, and whether the show itself, through everything it has built across nearly 3 decades of episodes, treats Cartman as someone who could have been stopped earlier, or as someone whose particular shape was, in some sense, already set long before any single episode began. Section 9. The business of being Cartman. There is a quieter side of Cartman that gets less attention than his elaborate revenge plots or his relationship with Heidi Turner, but it may say just as much about how his mind works. This is the side of him that shows up whenever money enters the picture, and one episode in particular lays this out with unusual clarity. That episode is called Cartman Land. It aired on July 25th, 2001 as the 6th episode of the show's 5th season, just 2 weeks after Scott Tenorman Must Die aired that same summer. The episode begins with the death of Cartman's grandmother, Mabel Cartman. At her funeral, Cartman treats her passing not with any real grief, but as a mild inconvenience standing between him and his weekend plans. This detail sets the tone for everything that follows. When her will is read, it turns out she has left her entire life savings, $1 million, to Cartman specifically, rather than splitting it among the wider family, seemingly because the rest of the relatives were considered likely to spend it irresponsibly. Cartman receives this enormous sum of money the same way he receives almost everything else in his life, with immediate excitement about what it can get him rather than any thought about saving it, investing it, or using it to help anyone else. What Cartman decides to do with $1 million says a great deal about what he actually values. He does not put it away for the future. He does not spend it on anything that might benefit his family or his own long-term well-being. Instead, he uses the entire sum to purchase an existing, struggling amusement park called North Park Funland from its owner, a man named Frank Fun, who is honest enough to warn Cartman up front that the park has been a financial failure. Cartman does not care. His goal is not to run a successful business or to make more money from the park. His goal, stated plainly in the episode, is to finally be free of something that has apparently bothered him his entire life: waiting in line at amusement parks. He wants a park that belongs entirely to him, where he never has to share a ride or stand behind another person again. Once the deal is finished, he renames the park Cartman Land and closes it to the public entirely, keeping it just for himself. This decision, spending everything on a private amusement park purely to avoid a small daily annoyance most people simply accept as part of visiting one, reveals something specific about how Cartman thinks about money. For him, money is not really about security or comfort or opportunity in any broad sense. It is about removing a specific irritation from his life as completely and permanently as possible, no matter how much that removal actually costs. $1 million, spent on eliminating the experience of waiting in line, is treated by Cartman as a reasonable, even obvious use of a fortune that could have changed his life in almost any other direction. Cartman's friend Kyle reacts to all of this with something close to despair. Hearing that Cartman, a boy Kyle considers deeply undeserving of good fortune, has been handed $1 million and appears genuinely happy for what seems like the first time, causes Kyle real physical stress, severe enough that he develops a painful medical condition that worsens as the episode continues. Kyle's reaction here is worth noting because it reflects something the show has built consistently around Cartman across many episodes: the sense that watching him succeed, even accidentally, feels wrong to the people who understand exactly what kind of person he is. Kyle is not simply annoyed. He is shown becoming seriously ill, hospitalized, and at one point losing his religious faith entirely, unable to reconcile a fair, orderly universe with the fact that someone as selfish as Cartman appears to be thriving. Owning the park does not remain simple for Cartman. Once Stan and Kyle attempt to sneak inside, defying his explicit ban on visitors, Cartman realizes he needs security to keep people out, and hires a guard. This is where the episode's real point begins to emerge. The guard refuses to accept free rides as payment, insisting on an actual salary instead. Cartman, having already spent his entire fortune on the park itself, has no cash left to pay pay anyone. Rather than admit he has run out of money, he agrees to let in a small number of paying visitors each day, specifically to cover the guards' wages. From there, the costs multiply on their own. A ride breaks and needs a repair worker. The repair worker's wages require even more paying visitors. Soon he needs staff to sell food and drinks as well, and the number of people he must let in each day keeps climbing simply to cover the basic costs of keeping the park running at all. What happens next is the detail that makes this episode so revealing about Cartman's mind specifically. Business commentators on television, watching from outside, begin describing Cartman's reluctant, expense-driven decision to slowly let in more visitors as a brilliant marketing strategy, something they call the "you cannot come" approach, treating his desperation as genius. The park becomes wildly successful, filled with paying customers every day, all while Cartman himself grows increasingly miserable, since the entire point of buying the park in the first place was to avoid exactly the crowded, line-filled experience he is now running a thriving business around. Eventually, unable to tolerate his own park being full of the very inconvenience he spent $1 million trying to escape, Cartman sells the park back to its original owner, satisfied simply to have his money returned to him. This is where the episode delivers its sharpest point about how little real understanding Cartman actually has about money, despite having handled a fortune throughout the entire episode. The moment he receives his $1 million back from the sale, government tax officials seize a significant portion of it, since Cartman, being a child running an unlicensed business, had never paid any taxes on the park's earnings. On top of this, the parents of his friend Kenny, who had died on one of the park's rides during the period it was open to the public, successfully sue Cartman over the death, taking a further portion of his money to cover their legal costs. By the end of the episode, Cartman is left not just without his park, but in debt by roughly $13,000, having gone from receiving a life-changing fortune to owing money he does not have, all within a matter of weeks. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spoken directly about how deliberately simple they wanted this episode's core idea to be. In commentary recorded for the show's DVD release, Parker explains that he and Stone initially worried the concept, a boy inheriting money and buying an amusement park, felt overly familiar and even a little boring on paper. They considered not making the episode at all, concerned it might come across as too basic. What convinced them to move forward was a realization Parker has described directly, that a simple, familiar premise can still support genuinely original writing once the specific scenes and specific choices inside that premise are built carefully. This matters here because it means the financial details in this episode, the exact chain of expenses, the exact way debt piles up once basic obligations like staff wages and tax records enter the picture, were not treated carelessly by the writers. They were built out deliberately, specifically because the writers wanted the economics of Cartman's mistake to feel believable rather than simply cartoonish. What this episode adds to the wider picture of Cartman's character is a kind of financial short-sightedness that sits somewhat apart from his usual cleverness. In episodes like Scott Tenorman Must Die or Casa Bonita, Cartman displays an unusual talent for predicting exactly how other people will behave several steps in advance. In Cartman Land, none of that same foresight shows up. He does not think about taxes. He does not think about staffing costs. He does not think about what running an actual business, even one built around avoiding lines, would actually require of him day to day. He simply wants something, gets it as fast and as completely as possible, and only discovers the real cost of that decision once it is already too late to undo cheaply. This suggests that Cartman's planning ability, so precise and effective when aimed at manipulating people emotionally or socially, does not extend nearly as far when the problem in front of him is something more mundane, like the basic mechanics of money and responsibility. He can predict exactly how a grieving friend, a trusting classmate, or a suspicious farmer will react to carefully placed information. He cannot, in this episode at least, predict that owning a business might come with obligations beyond simply spending money to buy it. This gap between social manipulation and financial understanding says something worth sitting with. Cartman's intelligence, wherever it comes from, is not evenly spread across every part of his life. It is sharpest exactly where it benefits him most directly and immediately, controlling how people around him think and feel in a given moment. It is far weaker in areas that require patience with systems rather than patience with people, tax law, staffing costs, or the basic upkeep required to keep something running over time rather than simply seizing it once. Even here though, the emotional core of the episode stays consistent with everything else already covered. Cartman spends a fortune not to build something lasting, not to help anyone, not even really to enjoy himself in any generous sense, but to remove one small personal irritation as completely and immediately as possible, regardless of what it actually costs him in the end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything examined so far, the schemes, the family history, the relationships, and now the money, comes back to the same voice performing all of it. The same man who has sat behind this character for nearly 30 years, shaping every laugh, every threat, and every quiet moment of cruelty into something audiences keep coming back to. Section 10. The character Trey Parker voices himself. Every scene examined across this analysis, the chili at the cook-off, the mother refusing to hold a boundary, the reveal of a father Cartman never knew he had killed, the slow reshaping of a girlfriend into a version of himself, the amusement park bought and lost within weeks, all of it comes out of the same mouth. That mouth belongs to Trey Parker, one of the two men who created South Park, and the person who has voiced Eric Cartman across every single one of the show's episodes since it first began airing on August 13th, 1997. Trey Parker was born on October 19th, 1969 in Conifer, Colorado, a small town not far from the fictional setting the show is named after. His father, Randolph Parker, worked as a geologist, and his mother, Sharon, worked as an insurance broker, and both of their names were later given directly to two of the show's adult characters, Randy and Sharon Marsh, who share their real-life occupations as well. Parker has said in interviews that Randy Marsh is essentially his own impression of his real father, something he continues to perform without much extra thought at this point, since the character has become such a familiar, almost automatic voice for him after so many years. This detail matters here because it shows how personal a project South Park has always been for Parker, built directly out of people from his own life rather than invented from nothing. Cartman is far from the only character Parker voices on the show. He also provides the voice of Stan Marsh, one of the show's 4 central boys, a character Parker himself has confirmed is largely based on his own personality growing up. This means the same actor performing Cartman's cruelty, his manipulation, and his complete lack of guilt is also performing the voice of the character most often positioned as the show's moral center, the one who reacts with horror when Cartman goes too far, the one who tells Cartman he is going to hell for refusing to help a dying friend, the one who stares in silence at the end of Scott Tenorman Must Die, unable to fully process what he has just witnessed. Both voices, the cruelty and the conscience reacting to it, come from the same person, take after take, episode after episode for nearly 3 decades. Parker's voice work extends well beyond these two characters. He also voices Randy Marsh, Stan's father, along with Mr. Garrison, the unstable elementary school teacher who has appeared in the show since its very first episode. Beyond these 4 major roles, Parker performs a long list of smaller recurring characters as well, including Mr. Hanky, a talking piece of holiday-themed excrement that appears each Christmas season, Mr. Mackey, the school counselor who appears in the very episode that examines Cartman's relationship with his mother, and Mr. Hat, the puppet Mr. Garrison uses as a teaching tool, itself based on a real hand puppet Parker's own childhood kindergarten teacher genuinely used in her classroom. Records of the show's full voice cast list dozens upon dozens of additional smaller roles Parker has voiced over the years. Everything from background adults with only a line or two of dialogue to fully developed recurring figures who return across multiple seasons. Matt Stone, the other co-creator of the show, handles a similarly large set of roles on his side, voicing Kyle Broflovsky, Kenny McCormick, and Butter Stotch, along with numerous smaller characters of his own. Just as Stan Marsh is based on Parker, Stone has confirmed that Kyle Broflovsky is based on himself, meaning the two central friendships driving the show, Stan and Kyle on one side, and both of them against Cartman on the other, are essentially built out of the real friendship between the two men who created the entire series. Cartman, notably, was not built to represent either of his creators personally in the same direct way. He exists instead as the outside force both of their more grounded, self-based characters have to continually respond to, react against, and occasionally get pulled along by, episode after episode. The way the show gets made adds another layer to how remarkable this voice performance actually is. South Park has long been known for an unusually fast production process. Episodes are frequently written, animated, and voiced within the single week leading up to their broadcast, sometimes finishing final work on an episode only a day or two before it airs. This tight schedule means Parker is not simply performing a well-rehearsed, carefully polished character built up slowly over months of preparation for each episode. He is voicing Cartman along with Stan, Randy, Garrison, and often several smaller characters in the very same episode, under significant time pressure week after week for a series that by now has produced well over 300 episodes across more than 2 decades on air. Parker's ability to move between these characters within the the same recording session, sometimes within the very same scene, requires a specific kind of vocal control. Cartman's voice is high, nasal, and whiny, built around specific catchphrases that have become widely recognized across popular culture, including his frequent, drawn-out complaint aimed at his mother, and his distinctive, mocking pronunciation of Kyle's name. Stan's voice, by contrast, sits lower and flatter, delivered with the kind of dry, slightly exhausted tone of someone who has grown used to being the reasonable one in a town full of chaos. Randy Marsh's voice carries a completely different energy again, often exaggerated and theatrical, matching a character Parker has described as the biggest fool in the entire show. Shifting convincingly between all three of these voices, along with everything else Parker performs, requires more than simply doing a funny voice once and repeating it. It requires maintaining several distinct, consistent vocal identities over an extraordinarily long stretch of time, all while writing, directing, and producing the show at the same time. This detail about production speed and vocal range is not simply trivia sitting apart from everything discussed earlier in this analysis. It connects directly back to the emotional weight some of Cartman's darkest moments managed to carry, despite the extremely compressed timeline behind their creation. The scene where Cartman reveals to Scott Tenorman exactly what has happened to his parents, the moment where Cartman licks tears from Scott's face while singing a taunting rhyme, the quiet, unsettling smile at the end of Tist, all of these moments were performed by Parker under the same rushed, week-long production schedule used for every other episode of the show. The fact that these scenes still land with the disturbing weight critics and fans have described for years, rather than feeling rushed or hollow, says something about how deeply Parker understands this character, even without extended time to sit with each individual performance before moving on to record the next. There is something worth sitting with in the simple fact that one person has now spent nearly 30 years giving voice to Eric Cartman specifically. Most actors who play a single memorable villain do so for the length of one film, one season, or at most a handful of years before moving on to other roles entirely. Parker has returned to this exact character episode after episode across a career that has also included directing, writing, and producing an enormous range of other projects, including films, a Broadway musical, and multiple other television projects, without ever stepping away from Cartman for any meaningful length of time. Whatever understanding Parker has built of how Cartman thinks, how he manipulates, how he justifies his own worst moments to himself, has had decades to deepen, refine itself, and stay consistent, even as the world around the show, and the specific targets of its satire, have changed dramatically since 1997. None of this changes any of the specific events already covered across this analysis. Cartman's actions in Scott Tenorman Must Die remain exactly as disturbing regardless of who performs his voice. His treatment of Heidi Turner remains exactly as troubling. His inability to feel grief over his own father's death remains exactly as revealing about how narrow his emotional world actually is. But knowing that all of these moments were shaped, performed, and sustained by the same person decade after decade adds one more layer to understanding why this character has remained so consistently compelling for so long. Cartman is not simply a collection of shocking plot points strung together across nearly 30 years of television. He is a single, sustained performance built patiently by one person who has clearly thought about this character carefully enough for long enough to make even his cruelest, strangest, most disturbing moments feel like they belong to a real, coherent person rather than a random assortment of jokes. Everything covered across this analysis, the planning, the manipulation, the enabling mother, the unknown father, the relationship that reshaped someone else in his own image, the money handled carelessly and lost just as fast, and now the single voice behind all of it adds up to a picture of a character built with far more care and consistency than his loudest, crudest moments might suggest at first glance. What remains once all of it is placed side by side is a portrait of someone whose worst qualities were never accidental, and whose most disturbing moments were never simply there for shock. They were built piece by piece, episode by episode, by two men who understood exactly what they were creating, and one voice that has never once let that creation waver. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.